Phillip Jensen was the first preacher I heard in Australia. I had just arrived in Sydney for high school and I wanted to go to church. So my sister, who knew about the university church nearby, since she was an alumnus of University of New South Wales, she thought about it and she decided uni church at University of New South Wales would be a good place for me. So off we went. And here was this man doing what we now take for granted in CRC, which was to open the scriptures and to work through it and to trust the scriptures to teach us the truth about God and about being obedient to Him. He wouldn't be what Christians today here especially would consider very hip. He was in knee-length pants, like I'm wearing right now, as a homage to him, wearing sandals. He didn't try hard to be funny or entertaining or even inspiring, and he had his hands in his pocket sometimes and he'd pace around a little bit looking at scriptures and his notes, and he was sucking a lozenge to keep his throat going, and you could tell that. And at that point he was maybe doing 4 sermons a week, so sometimes he'd be a little bit tired, and I suppose that focus on getting the Bible taught instead of putting on a show that would inspire people, we've inherited that too. And he did all that in a time when Hillsongs was just kind of in a few suburbs away, and that ministry was growing very fast. So in the midst of that challenge, he just kept doing that. And that was all very much up my alley, because I was already a very serious kind of guy when it came to thinking about these matters. I had become a Christian by reading a gospel, possibly around 15 years of age. And I could see that this Jesus was more than worthy of being followed from my reading of the gospel. And at that point in my room, I answered his call, not having really been to any churches or being taught by the Bible, taught from the Bible by anyone. So when I arrived in Australia and when I first saw this preacher and he was working through the scriptures, I just lapped it all up. I bought a lot of cassettes of his preaching over the years and just tried to learn as much as I could. There was one point when, just before I came back from Australia, I had a stack about this high, and the church cassette fulfillment service took months to produce it. And of course, at that point I didn't have a car, and I was mostly on a bicycle, but I would often listen to him on a Walkman, and then next day I'd wake up with the earphones fallen out, and I find out I'd fallen asleep to his voice. So it's fair to say that Phillip was really the teacher who first taught me the Bible and gave me a firm foundation as a disciple. So from the time I was in senior high school through university, as often as I could, I would ask him questions. More than once, I think, I walked with him until we arrived at his house. And I don't know whether he was okay with that, but it just happened. And this wasn't actually normal, because people would just ask him a question and then they'd go back to fellowship with the others. And I would have to wait, and I'd want to wait to be the end, because I had so many questions and I wanted a fuller conversation. I really didn't have anyone else who had discipled me this way when I was a teenager before that as a Christian alone in Malaysia. And so we'd all just we ended up just walking all the way back to his house in the kind of almost the next suburb. And that was very helpful for me. It helped to shape my thinking, especially about God, and looking at the world from his eyes, and learning to also, think theologically, much like what we're trying to do here in CRC. And in a way, that was really the beginning of my apprenticeship. So at the point of my graduation from university, I'd already decided to aim towards full-time paid ministry. And it was also, therefore, Philip's ambitions for God's church that I witnessed in all those years that I was there in St. Matthias. That was what fueled this similar ambition to please God and to serve Him back here in Malaysia as well. Because Philip didn't just think of faithfulness as being limited to just sitting in a study and then producing an exegetically sound sermon. He understood it to incorporate the grand vision of God's kingdom, and he was always interested in strengthening the work and expanding it. So in church, we were always seeing missionary activity. Missionaries would come back and talk about what they've been trying to do overseas, and they were part of the results of Philip's work. And there were also attempts in the church at new initiatives in ministry. Some were successful, some not so. And often we were church planting. Under Philip, the number of churches, congregations grew from 1 to about 14 by the time I left. And of course as well was the student ministry work and raising church officers. Philip started also something called Club 5, where a lot of us who are interested in thinking about full-time faith ministry would go to be taught the scriptures and to think about these things seriously. And it was kind of unheard of, I would think, because there were so many of us that it had a real impact on more theological college later, especially my first year, when there weren't even enough chairs for us in the first class. And that was all to do with Philip's large, expansive view of growing God's kingdom. And he also did it in a way that actually attempted to address the problems. So it wasn't just an insular way out of a pietistic sense of just being faithful to kind of an insulated holiness, but it was an understanding practically of God's rule, such that if the church was to be built up, then students would have to be taught the Bible better in universities, and conferences had to be organized, and everyone would have to be challenged to treat ministry as full-time, and idolatry of career and lifestyle would therefore actually be condemned in church, in sermons, and in ministry to each other. And money, manpower would actually have to be poured at some risk into old and new institutions. And Philip didn't show fear of rocking the boat in an attempt to get the boat moving better and ultimately to protect its passengers. Some people, of course, would accuse him of building his own empire, but he was really just trying to solve problems and to grow God's kingdom. And within the ministry, we knew he wasn't perfect, but he was God's leader, and we were prepared to serve God under him. And university ministry was typical of this characteristic of Philip's ministry as well, because up until Philip starting campus Bible study, the ministry prior to that was active on campus, the Fellowship Evangelical students. At that time, they weren't up to scratch in their word ministry on campus. I mean, AFES is quite good now across Australia, but what Philip had to do with campus Bible study was to focus on teaching students the Bible so that they would honor God's authority. And so he did that by upholding God's authority in his word from the pulpit, and he got us all to read the Bible for ourselves and to submit to that authority, and to also learn to minister it to our fellow students and hopefully also eventually fellow workers. So student ministry across Australia itself has been really helped by this catalyst that started from, I think, New South Wales University. And CRC thankfully has had the same impact, although in a much smaller area, of course. And of course the opposition is similar, although here maybe in my view it has been somewhat more intense in some ways, because we're starting from a base that's very different and further behind than when Philip took over New South Wales University, I think. But when Philip first took over the running of the university church, a lot of people didn't like it and they left. And when student ministry in university changed under him, some people were suspicious and they were critical as well. And many initiatives that he launched were doubted, sometimes internally, and people also dragged their feet. But Philip's ambition for God meant that his leadership avoided a false dichotomy between what is sacred and what is secular. The MTS apprenticeship, for instance, it had the word strategy in it, which by some people they would think that's a little bit secular. And it really comes from the understanding that in the end all things belong to God, and also an understanding of soli Deo Gloria. Even in terms of his theology of ministry, both he and I have got a lot of flack for teaching predestination, for instance. But we don't teach it to upset Christians. We teach it because it gives glory to God's grace in saving people. And unsurprisingly, in Malaysia, the critics include people who would be positive about the gospel and acknowledge actually a doctrine like that, and yet are unrealistic about the way in which people grow and change and are to be challenged in their theological presuppositions as Christians. So I suppose the key thing Phillip modeled in all of this was the importance of standing up and leading, rooted in, fueled by gospel convictions. Over the years, we've been in numerous situations where the choice has been between being politically astute and maybe buying favor or good standing by being inclusive and compromising, or to protect the integrity of the word ministry and to lose our potential friends. Not everyone in the evangelical world here, I think, understands the threats within evangelical ministry, and not everyone is willing to pay the price of building a platform that is uncompromised. So often, sadly, in the last 10 years, we've had to go it alone, and we've had to pay a pretty heavy price for that, in my estimation. But the benefit, of course, is a kind of church that you see around you at the end of our 10th year in CRC. And here in our own country, with GE14 recently, ironically, we've had to learn this in some way from certain national leaders who have taken the lead in fighting for the truth with their lives, with this often leading to jail time. And this also involved going against the popular vote and taking the lead in a way which people were accused of being somewhat dictatorial. But the average person, can make that accusation easily without counting the cost of what happens when no one takes the stand. And Phillip wasn't afraid to be a leader in order to protect the church and build it up. And he definitely got a strong reaction to that. The way some people made fun of us, for instance, in those days, was to call us all Jensenites. But it is necessary to do these things, to be this kind of leader, to build this kind of church. It is necessary to do this in order that the church itself can be built in a way that honors Jesus Christ. And there is a reason why Paul sees it necessary, for instance, to rebuke Peter in public for his failure to be consistent with the gospel. And Peter, as an apostle, needed that rebuke. And because Peter is an apostle, he needed to be rebuked. And on this, I suppose, I definitely have not been as faithful to Phillip's example. And for the last 10 years, if we're, I think, reasonable in our assessment of our ministry, we've probably often kept a much lower profile. But Phillip has been working and ministering at a much more public pace. Phillip has often defended the gospel against certain unfaithful men in public, in a synod, in writing, in preaching, in conference material. So I think being Asian has not been always helpful in this regard, and definitely we have to be wary at this point in our 10 years of this particular failure on my part, because we see that, or at least I see that the generation of Asians coming from overseas, including Australia, show sometimes little awareness of this model, and they have become increasingly reductionistic. It's almost as if theirs is if we do Bible study and if we teach directly from the text, then that's enough. Ministry will take care of itself. But I worry about this not just in terms of perhaps what's been happening overseas, but in our own church. I think I can see that possible future in our own present leaders. I'm concerned that on our 10th year here, we look at Phillip and look at the attempt on our part here to try to do what is faithful and necessary in ministry, and we learn from that. So right now, I hope that as a church, we can be courageous and continue to step into a position of conflict at times in order to protect the gospel without compromise, just as Phillip did. So Phillip's also influenced, therefore, our understanding of leadership in terms of church government. He, of course, is an Anglican, and in our own ministry, we haven't adopted either just the Anglican or the Congregationalist polity. It must be the word of Christ that rules us, not the popular vote or the most influential members of the church, whether they are the leaders or the majority, which is sadly is how these things have turned out for often Congregationalism in this part of the world. So the reality is that all of us who are able to teach and lead must do so that the church will be able to rise from culture's grip over us of worldliness. And that's what I was privileged to learn from Phillip, so that even as an Episcopalian, the church members had a lot of responsibility and leadership and authority. And at the same time, he never feared to show what it meant for a leader to take charge and to take a firm stand, obviously, and also to lead from the front and to take the initiative, even if church people were sometimes lagging behind. And I've seen him take that stand publicly, even against church leaders who were much more influential and powerful than he was, people who denied the resurrection. I've seen him take that stand against church members who wanted to fashion the church in their own image. And I know that Phillip's been threatened with a lawsuit and personally has suffered throughout. And his pain modeled for me the life of a minister, which I've tried to, with some failure, do with you as well. And honestly, in the essence of a father who could lead me in the scriptures, Phillip was something of a father to me, a Christian father. I don't actually know Phillip outside of ministry, but in all my travels and living in several countries and not really having ultimately a so-called home, and also being called a pendatang in my own home in Malaysia, and then also finding a real kindred pulse in the Australian life that I had as a teenager. What I learned in all of that with Phillip as this Christian father teacher was I learned from the gospel call to have heaven as my home and to be able to serve anywhere. That's why by the time I reached the end of my apprenticeship and I was asked to consider going to Melbourne instead, I could more easily maintain the trajectory that we had worked out was best for God, which was to be here. And it wasn't because I was blind to the comforts and temptations of being in Australia. It wasn't because we thought Malaysia was more luxurious given my family's established status here, and at that time was something of an outcast. It was because God's call was identical to being his disciple and servant. And I thank God that Phillip exemplified that. And comfort and family and relationships, they all come with, not apart from this call to serve him. So CRC has been and is the family for us, the household of God, and therefore also mine, because I serve his people. So this is why, although our practice is for me to teach and address the church during camp on various topics, for our 10th year celebrations this year, I decided to invite Phillip to do this, and on a topic, in fact, which he has made a big contribution to my own life. I'd say that the main reason why I approached marriage the way I did was because of Phillip's understanding of marriage and how God guides us in this and other relationships. So whether it is with our parents or children or co-workers, the vertical relationship with God should never be absent, and Phillip made sure that all of us had that worldview, and I wanted the church that has been built on this to hear from him directly. But Phillip isn't here simply to teach on the topic of relationships, which I'm sure he'll do very well in this week. I've watched evangelicals who have come from similar or same ministries as I did. And over the years, as I've said, I think I am concerned about a failure to really grasp the landscape of how we are to grow churches in this context and the costs of this change and the means of it. So I've seen ministers become purveyors of growth at the expense of real church strength. And I've seen also the fruit of these ministries deny what is needed to protect the church. So Phillip and his ministry are here to remind us of what that will take. Phillip in that way is a celebration of the past, but hopefully we will, as CRC, be moving forward into a ministry of suffering for the gospel on the foundation of the apostolic ministry that we see in Paul and also people and ministers like Phillip.